Chapter 8. The air roared past Abigail Ali as she dropped into the fray, firing down at the insect-sized soldiers on the ground, who scurried about and took pot shots at them. The English were short on resources, and only had crude, old-fashioned guns. Still, sometimes they were lucky. A dead man in a shredded chute dropped suddenly past Abby's left. He hit the side of one of the pristine skyscrapers, windows smashing around him. Broken glass and gore rained down onto the heads of his killers. Abby and her comrades fired back in force. Column after column of brilliant blue energy rings swirled down to decimate the English men and defences. As she got steadily nearer, Abby could be more discriminating. She hit one of the English soldiers as he tried to find cover, the arc of blue light puncturing his forehead and exploding his brains out the back of his neck. She swallowed, unable to look away. This was an invasion, and they had no call for more subtle weaponry. She tugged on the control straps hanging by her head, determined not to let the crosswinds drag her into the massed English ranks. Some of her comrades had been killed that way, too keen on shooting to control their descent. She aimed for a wide expanse of courtyard, littered with fewer clumps of charred masonry and bodies, and downwind from the backs of retreating English soldiers. 10 metres from the ground, then 5, and Abby yanked back hard on the control straps. The chute responded, lurching her upwards again by a metre, slowing her rate of descent quite drastically. She got one booted foot onto the ground and clicked to the release, rolling out from under the chute as it was given up to the breeze. Gun in her hand, Abby leapt into a deserted gun post, nestling down behind the cover of sandbags. She peeped her head out to see a parachute billowing, picking up speed now it was free of her weight. The great sail swept across the courtyard and caught itself up in some of the fleeing men. They struggled to extract themselves, one man screaming hysterically like he'd seen the funny side. They were sitting ducks, and Abby picked them off one by one. The main action was some way from her now. Explosions sounded a block or two westwards. Heart hammering, Abby checked all round before venturing into the open again. She could see no one around. Taking a breath, she bolted in the direction of the voices and fighting. After a frantic sprint across open ground, she emerged onto a street strewn with the dead of both sides. The English had clearly suffered the worst losses. Some of the bodies still moved, the wounded crying out for aid that would not be coming soon. "Drive them into the river!" That was Wu, just a street away, his authority clear over the relentless "Vlati, Vlati" of South African guns, and the sporadic "Rat-a-tat" in reply. Another street, and Abby emerged into the battle. The English were withdrawing. They were simply outgunned. They would desperately pick over the corpses of Abby's own side and take their weapons, but couldn't fathom how to use them. London had never progressed beyond bullets. The English were cowed by technology of all kinds, and would never have parleyed with the machine people like Abby's own government had. "Abigail Ali?" She didn't shoot the man who called out, though his accent and uniform were English. Instinct overrode her reflexes, and it took her a second to see why. She squinted at the gaunt, battered man in the enemy uniform. He was older, far older than he should be, and his face was dappled with bruises. A nasty mark just above one eye showed where someone had punched him. "Griff," she said, "what have you done to yourself?" "There's a war on, Abby," he replied, that old mocking tone grating in his new voice. 3 frightened technicians in lab coats huddled behind him. He must have been keeping them away from the fighting. "None of you have any armour on." Abby looked all about them, checking the real English were nowhere nearby. "We must get you to cover. No HQ up yet, though. Any bright ideas? We'll need a place for the wounded, somewhere big and easy to defend." Griffiths shrugged. "Something you've left in one piece." The male technician beside him stepped forward. "I think I've an idea, actually." "You must get your people out of here, General. You're outmanned and outgunned." "I knew you weren't with us, Doctor," Bamford yelled back over the noise of the fighting outside. The general stood at the front of the command post, practically right out in the open. Since she so evidently wanted to be in the thick of the fighting, Kelly couldn't understand why she didn't just get on with it. She achieved nothing where she was, barking out orders as she might rail against a thunderstorm. And with her in the way, Kelly and the doctor could only estimate how the invaders were doing, basing their assessments on what they could hear. "It's not that," snapped the doctor, calling forward over the shoulders of the men between himself and Bamford. The general could barely have heard him, Kelly thought. "I just don't share your glee for killing the most people possible. It's unnecessary." Eyes still on the battle, Bamford called back to her officers. "If he speaks out of turn again, you can shoot him." She didn't even look round. The doctor muttered something under his breath. The tall captain right in front of him turned to look at him. The doctor smiled demurely until he looked away again. Kelly, pressed against the back wall of the bunker, was the only one who could see that the doctor was not taking sides. His sharp wits had puzzled out the invasion. He knew Bamford was defeated and could now only lose more of her men. He didn't care that Bamford was losing, he just hated the wastage, Kelly sympathised. He wouldn't say so out loud, of course, but things could be better for a man like him under the new regime. The South Africans had respect for learning. He found himself grinning at the doctor. "You know what they're using against us," he said, leaning in close to be heard. "Those have to be laser guns. We'd heard rumours about them." The doctor listened, his face alive at the prospect, though he also seemed wary of speaking out. "That's lazy conjecture," he ventured. "It could be ultrasonics for all we know. That burbling noise would make more sense if it was." He was cut off by another volley of strange South African gunfire, loud and nearby. The invaders were almost on top of them. Of course, Kelly thought, retreat was the only practicable option. Why didn't Bamford see that? Again, he was cowed by the doctor's knowledge of the most esoteric and involved subjects. He must know more than he said about what the weapons might be. Kelly peered over the shoulders of the officers in his way. He could see little but smoke, and nothing with which to refute the doctor's claim. If only they were nearer the front, he'd have had a better view. In fact, he had already said as much, and more than once. But the soldiers ignored him. Their own needs came first, though their comments on the battle were hardly illuminating. They merely found more contrived ways to opine that the South Africans could and would be defeated. Kelly's wry comment about the lack of an evidence base for that had already earned him a stern look from Bamford. Still, her officers had grown edgy too. "This position is not going to be tenable soon," shouted one of the men to Bamford's left, and no more tactfully than the doctor had put it. His name was Skinner, Kelly thought, one of the more able ones. "I can see that," Bamford yelled back. No one said anything. The gunfire and screaming continued outside, growing steadily closer. Kelly suddenly wondered if she would make them sit it out, let the enemy reach them, and kill them on some obscure point of honour. It was the sort of thing he thought soldiers might do. He hated the injustice of it, the stupidity. Bamford reached into her coat and withdrew an envelope, marked with a seal of red wax. She hesitated before passing it back without a word. Skinner opened it and withdrew a single page of foolscap. Kelly and the doctor both strained to see what the paper said. Little was written there, maybe no more than a couple of sentences. Yet Kelly could make nothing out, and nor, he felt sure, could the doctor. Skinner read it over twice, then tucked the page into his pocket. "Take 2 men, the general commanded. Skinner saluted, selected 2 officers from those stood behind him, and hurried out into the thick of the fighting. Kelly could feel the tension in the bunker, and knew he'd missed the significance of whatever had just happened. He thought better of asking, though, especially now that Bamford had her eyes on him. "Major," she called back, "you and the doctor will accompany me back to the lab." "I should say that's rather a hazardous journey right this minute," the doctor shouted back. "It's an order." The doctor shook his head sadly. "Well, that's all very well," he muttered, "but I fail to see what you hope to achieve there." "Courage, Doctor," Bamford said. "We've still your police box to deal with." Barbara tended the wounded, barely conscious of what she was doing or where she was, just keeping busy. Susan knelt next to her, doing the same. She chatted away to the soldiers, whether they could hear her or not. Canary Wharf Station was packed out with the wounded, gathered up from both sides by the South Africans. What limited medical resources there were, they shared evenly among them. You could tell the difference, though. The South African army mostly comprised blacks, but all of them were well-built, tall and athletic, like the American GIs Barbara recalled from her youth. They all had good teeth. Some of the English, still able to speak, were refusing treatment. Barbara looked after them anyway. Griffiths raced about, swapping materials and gleaning news. Abby helped out, her eyes peeled, constantly on watch. Wu, the Chinese who had given them their orders, had told her to be bodyguard. Barbara couldn't believe, for all she had seen, that Bamford's troops would attack their makeshift hospital. Not when it was full of their own men, too. She was glad to be occupied, to have something she could do, and glad that Ian was kept busy on the far side of the hall. He had taken a job as a stretcher-bearer, helping get the sick in and out of the lifts. He gathered up their belongings, ran errands, carried people. He, too, was desperate to be useful. Abby came over to her. "Hey," she said. It was a strange Afrikaans greeting, too casual for Barbara's liking. She knew Abby was eager to make friends, just unsure where exactly to start. Barbara realised why. Griffiths had stood off from Abby, acted cold to her. Abby had given him all the news of what his daughter was up to, 8 now, pretty and good at mathematics, and Griffiths had not said a word. Barbara had been shocked by how long he had been in London. He had not seen his daughter in more than 4 years. Griffiths still didn't say a word about that either. He organised the hospital and got them all moving. Now he kept his distance from them. Barbara wasn't the only one bowled over by how different he had become, suddenly commanding, responsible for the whole strategy of attack, and able to brief Wu on all that had happened to them. Susan had gazed at him agog while he played down his own role in their various escapes, and made Ian out to be the hero. Abby, too, couldn't keep her eyes off him. She glanced at Barbara, and they realised they were both staring after him. Abby grinned. "We're just friends," she said. "We were at school together, that's all." Susan beside them snorted. They looked round, and the girl blushed scarlet. She said nothing, hiding her face as she fussed with a bandage, already placed where it should be. Abby shrugged at Barbara, who grinned back, despite her mounting feelings of awe. The women of this time were different, it seemed. Stronger, more competent, a match for any man. She'd met very few Indians before, anyway. But still, Barbara wanted to ensure that they'd be friends. She wanted this woman on her side. "How long has your country been comrades of the South Africans?" she said, just to make conversation. Abby stared at her, wide-eyed. "I am South African," she said, and Barbara blanched at the anger in her words. "Oh, I'm sorry, forgive me. We're so terribly ignorant of the outside world." Abby took a deep breath, but she could not disguise her scorn. "Whites were always the minority in our country," she said. "It was only a matter of time. But we didn't round them up, the minorities, not like you did. Griffiths and I were at school together. We were in the same class." "I'm really very sorry," said Barbara, fighting back tears. She was suddenly aware that in all the time they had been here, until the South Africans had arrived, she had not seen a single non-Caucasian face. It had never struck her as odd until now, and she'd been even more surprised by Griffiths taking his orders from a Chinese. No, she corrected herself, cursing her own prejudice. Wu was South African too. She was filled with shame. She'd felt torn before, watching London invaded, but now she didn't know what to feel at the fall of the English. She had, after all, seen what they did in the facility on Byng Street. They really sent everyone they could spare then, teased Griffiths right behind her. Barbara noted a hint of Afrikaans creeping into his accent. She wondered what he'd overheard, and if he had come to distract them. It might just have been good timing. "You're not with infantry, Abby?" "Volunteered, though," Abby replied sweetly. "Missing you too much." There was an awkward silence, Griffith seeming to realise he'd walked in on something. "We're worth fighting for," Barbara said quietly. "We can change things here, make them better." Abby sized her up. "Yes," she concluded in all seriousness, "we've a duty to do so. Things don't just need changing here, though. The regime needs sweeping away." Her zeal was disturbing, and Barbara recalled what Griffiths had said to her during the interview on Byng Street. He had asked her about moral obligations. He had sounded her out as a possible ally, even then. But what of the obligations Susan had alluded to? The look the doctor had given them, back when he went to see Griffiths, had borne that same absolute, righteous conviction that now scared her in Abby. Suddenly Abby was on her feet, and she and Griffiths were racing across the ticket hall. Barbara turned to look. There was a man on the escalator up to the surface. He carried a rifle. He was English. Someone cried out to him, told him to stop. The man kept coming down the stairs. Halfway down, he reached for something. Electric gunfire echoed through the ticket hall. Blue swirls of light jerked the man backwards, and whatever had been in his hand fell forward, clattering down the steps. Soldiers around Barbara cried out in alarm. Someone grabbed her arm, pulled her backwards. As she turned to protest, there was an explosion right behind her. The gunfire started in earnest, and a second grenade burst right in the centre of the wounded soldiers. A band of English troops took position at the top of the escalators, a commanding view down on them all. Ian had Barbara and Susan both by the wrist, dragging them away from the prone bodies. He shouted something to them, but it was lost over the noise of the fighting. Barbara saw a man try to rise from his stretcher, his arm out, pleading for help. She looked quickly away as a grenade fell beside him. "Stay here!" Ian shouted again. He hurried off, and Barbara clung to Susan in a nook at one side of the ticket hall, hiding the girl's eyes from the chaos. Ian darted back, helping people to their feet. She remembered what Andrews had said, the Andrews she had talked to where the gunmen were now, that first time they'd escaped. He had said Griffiths was braver by not carrying a gun when everyone else did. She could see that now with Ian. Without one, he didn't look outward at the battle raging around him. He just got on with helping people. He might be hit any second, was powerless to do anything about it. That fact seemed to liberate him. The lifts pinged, an absurd and cheery note amid the fighting. Barbara saw English soldiers emerge, firing into the backs of the South Africans who'd faced the barrage from the stairs. She saw Griffiths and Abby spinning round to blast blue light back at the lifts. English troops poured down the escalators, some reaching the floor alive. Wounded men grappled with them, even those from their own side. One man, Barbara saw, had his eyes gouged out. An English soldier stared right back at her, raising his gun as someone else shot him first. Blood spat from his mouth and nose as he fell. She had lost track of Ian. No, there he was, across the hall. He stared back at her, yelling something. She looked round. The soldier's face was bloody as he lunged for her, and he had lost some fingers. Pulling Susan behind her, Barbara ducked out of his way and smacked her shoulder into the wall. She had nowhere to escape to. Susan yelped and kicked out at the man. He leered, and blood dribbled from between his broken teeth. Susan kicked him in the shins, but he kept on coming. He put his arm around the girl's throat. Barbara pummeled him with her fists, but he smacked her with his free hand, and she found herself dazed and down on the floor. Struggling to her feet, she heard Susan's choked whimper. The man had his back to Barbara, and she saw a knife in his belt. Without a moment's thought, she grabbed it and plunged it into his back. Susan dropped to the floor, gagging. The man wheeled round on Barbara, his eyes boggled. He reached around for the knife, but his fingers couldn't get a purchase on it. He tried to say something, to explain to her, as his legs gave out under him. Barbara reached out, wanting to stop him falling back onto the knife. The man waved her off, lost his balance and fell forward. His body and face slapped smack into the floor. Barbara helped Susan to her feet. The fighting had died down as the raiders were overcome. At the top of the escalators, she could see Wu and his men battling with gunmen. She spied Andrews too, 3 of him. For a moment she thought he was fighting the South Africans, but it was soon clear that he had swapped sides too. She felt immense relief. "You're all right." Ian stood panting beside her. Susan ran to him. He had reached them as fast as he could, she could see. But surely the real Ian would never have left them alone. Abby hurried over and glanced down at the dead man. "Good," she said, appraising Barbara. "Desperate last effort, this lot." "You've beaten them? Looks like it." The guns and the yelling soon faded, and there were more injured people to tend. Skinner bashed at the toughened glass with the butt of his rifle. On his first strike, the glass quivered, a strange note reverberating down the platform. He hit again, more firmly, and the glass fractured. It had been designed to shatter into small and harmless pieces. Upstairs, the gunfire was dying down. They had never had much chance against the South Africans' laser weapons, but he was angry that it had been so quick. Good men had been killed in that last stand, yet they would not have died in vain. They had given him the distraction he needed to slip past with his unit down into the tunnels. He leapt down from the platform, squishing mice underfoot. The dirty white creatures positively teemed. They must have thrived since the trains had stopped running, he thought. His men jumped down, gathering behind him, awaiting his word. The darkness of the tunnel in front of them did not inspire confidence. Skinner produced a torch. "Let's get on with it," he said, running headlong into the gloom. The men would have to keep up with him, if only to stay with the light. The ticket hall was a mess, the medical resources even worse than they had been. They did what they could. While Barbara worked, she listened to the discussion between Griffiths and Wu. "Bamford's gone back to the lab," said Wu. "Holed up there with what's left of her men." "That's where we'll head next, then," chipped in Abby. "There's also the tunnels below us," said Griffiths. "That's what they attacked us here for. I saw Skinner and some of Bamford's other key players dash off down that way." "You don't think they were simply escaping?" It was not a question. "No, sir. The tube takes them under the river." "To the peninsula," Wu nodded. "That's not good. Right, Griffiths, you take the lab, and Abby, you're with me." Abby and Griffiths just nodded at each other as they went their separate ways. Barbara recoiled at their cold, functional manners. How could people live like that, their emotions so guarded? The South African soldiers divided up into 2 teams. Barbara would have been happy to remain behind to continue with nursing the sick. However, Ian had other ideas. Without a word to her first, he volunteered to help Griffiths. "Bamford still has the doctor with her," he explained. "Yes, we've got to come with you," agreed Susan, eager to be away from the wounded and dead. "I can't guarantee he'll survive this," Griffiths told her. "He's on her side." "But he's not on anyone's side." "That doesn't make things any better for him, Susan." The girl pouted, and Griffiths rolled his eyes indulgently. "Okay," he said. "We'll do what we can for him." "They'll be on us any moment," Bamford called out. "I want that thing gone before they get here." Balanced on the wheeled pivot, the police box was trundled toward the test room. One man bent under the back of it, steering the trolley, while soldiers swarmed round and directed him. Their comrades let them through, then worked to barricade the entrance to the lab. They expected the siege any moment. The police box halted abruptly outside the test room. The doctor stood in their path, his expression stern. It even made Bamford hesitate. "Get out of the way, doctor," she told him. I can't allow you to do this, General. It won't make any difference. You'll only make matters worse. Get him out of the way, she said. If the soldiers noticed the uncertainty in her voice, they did not show it. A soldier stepped forward. The doctor stared the man down, and Bamford thought they might have to drag him away kicking and screaming. The soldier took another step and brandished his pistol. The doctor's shoulders sagged. He smiled sadly at Bamford and stepped out of the way of the door. The soldiers bundled the police box into the test room. Kelly started up the machinery. The test room came alive, gradually building up light and noise. The soldiers readied the box, tipping the trolley forward so that it fell into the arms of the waiting men. They lifted the thing between them and carried it up to the searing ring of light. "We haven't set an anchor," Kelly called out, puzzling over the dials. "I don't understand what it's fixed to." Bamford smiled. "Destiny," she said. Across the room, the doctor regarded her. He nodded, understanding, a look she had longed for too many years. Did he know what she was then? And for how long had he known? The soldiers edged the police box further towards the hoop. Tendrils of light reached out to the object, caressing it, pulling it inwards. The soldiers staggered as the hoop snatched it from their grasp. As she had known it would, the hoop wanted the police box, recognized it, claimed it as its own. "Vlote, vlote, vlote!" Electric blue pulsed across the lab from behind them. It burst against the observation window of the test room and shattered the glass. One of the soldiers tottered over, shards embedded in the back of his head and neck. He bashed into the police box before he slumped to the ground. The barricade was obliterated in that instant. Bamford reached for her pistol. "Not a moment too soon," called the doctor behind her. "Get the police box gone," she cried back. The men simply let the light take it from them. With an electrical noise like a kiss, the police box vanished from the test room. The men who had carried it now rushed to Bamford's defence. Together, they faced the South African horde who fought their way into the lab. There was no cover, either for them or for her. Bamford shot one man, aiming for his face, but ripping open his throat and nearly taking his whole head off. The man stumbled backwards, his body tangling up under his fellows as they charged over him. Bamford shot another of them, and realised as he fell back he had been Colonel Andrews. Of course, she thought, the man had gone over to the enemy. Despite their strange alien weapons, the soldiers didn't shoot back at her. They must want her alive, and those guns wouldn't allow them just to disarm her. They were too powerful, too devastating. She shot 3 more men, then held back, knowing she had just a single bullet left. The South Africans kept piling into the room. Another Colonel Andrews was among them, and another. He must have helped his other selves escape. Inevitable, really, she thought. She'd known they were trouble, that they needed putting down. She levelled her gun at him, recognising the band round his wrist, the one that said he was Andrews V. The enemy soldiers took positions around her. Her own soldiers were cornered, and they looked to her for their lead. "Drop the gun, General." Bamford knew the voice, or rather she knew something like it. The timid double agent, Griffiths, was with the enemy too. Now he was all bravado, even his accent had warped. Behind him, among the soldiers, were the civilians, the 2 women, and even the man, Ian, had survived. More duplicates, more aberrations. She didn't have enough bullets to put them all right. Bamford kept the gun on Andrews. This was the original man, the one who had started all the trouble. He deserved to be shot. Still, with just her 1 bullet left, she waited, bided her time. The soldiers and civilians fanned around them. To her right, the civilians hurried up to the doctor. Of course, they were all in league together. She had expected as much. Griffiths stepped forward. "We can sort this out," he said, showing no fear. There was no way out of this, she knew. She had lost. And yet, She had scored one last important point against them, hearing the doctor's heartfelt admission to his friends. "You're too late," he said. "We've lost the ship." Bamford kept her arm out straight, the gun aimed squarely at the bridge of Andrews's nose. "No one do anything," Griffiths told his troops, taking his place beside Andrews. It was an uncharacteristically brave thing to do, Bamford thought. Double agents were always such cowards. "There's nothing you can do," she mocked, eyes locked on her target. "In an enclosed space like this, your laser guns will only kill your friends. Really, Griffiths, you—" She stopped. Ian had joined Griffiths and the Andrews. "You think you can build a better England on your lies and these—" She nodded her head towards Ian and the Andrewses. "These aberrations. You're an idiot, Mr. Griffiths." "Thank you, General," he demurred. "You might kill me now, but your allegiances to each other won't last. Loyalty, trust, these aren't easy to come by. They take an effort you don't even understand. My men know where they are with me. You, Griffiths, command troops who'll always be watching their backs." "If I might ask a question," said the doctor from behind her. He stepped forward, not joining the others clustered round Andrews, but taking a spot well out of range of the gun. Bamford resisted the urge to look at him, to take her eyes off her target. The crafty old fox, she thought. He knew how to make things most difficult for her. He was far more astute than his friends had been. "Why do the duplicate people bother you?" asked the doctor. He spoke quietly, musingly, yet it chilled her. "You've lived a long time," he continued, "seen many things most people wouldn't even believe. I can recognize that in you. We're alike, you and I." Bamford said nothing, ignoring his steely gaze. The gun felt heavy in her hand. She tensed her figure around the trigger. "You're what, in your 60s now?" the doctor went on. "So, you would have been born at the end of the last World War." "Yes," she said, her hand beginning to waver. She felt sweat bead down her forehead. He knew. Of course he knew. "So, tell us something from your past, What were you doing, if you can recall, when President Kennedy was shot?" Bamford said nothing. "The president was shot at?" said Barbara from over by the test room where she huddled with the other civilians. "Well," said the doctor, "or aren't you old enough?" "You know, don't you?" said Bamford, in a voice that sounded timid even to herself. The doctor drew himself up to his full height. "Yes, I know," he said. "You're also a time traveller, aren't you?"